It is night in a stone fortress. Somewhere in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a candle flickers. A group of nurses enters a vaulted chamber, carrying swaddled newborns. Their instructions are clear and terrible. They are to feed the infants, wash them, and keep them alive, but they must never speak to them. No lullabies, no words, not even a whisper. The man who ordered this is not a monster from myth or rumor. He's the most powerful ruler in medieval Europe, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, King of Sicily, King of the Romans, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a man the Church would one day call the Antichrist. In papal letters of the time, Frederick was described as a dragon with many heads. Pope Gregory IX compared him to King Herod, the slayer of infants, and even issued a decree warning Europe that a beast has risen from the sea. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was part of a campaign to strip him of divine legitimacy. According to a 13th century monk named Salimbene de Adam, Frederick wanted to answer a question that had haunted philosophers since antiquity. What was the very first language of humankind? He believed that if infants were raised without ever hearing a word, they would spontaneously speak it, the language of God. Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, or something older, lost before Babel. But as the months passed, the children didn't begin to speak. They grew sick. One by one, they died in their silence. No one recorded their names. Only the rumor survived that the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had killed children in his search for the voice of heaven. But who was this man, this emperor so obsessed with the origins of speech that he turned his nursery into a laboratory? And did this experiment ever really happen? He was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And, as mentioned earlier, to the popes of his age, the closest thing Europe had to an Antichrist. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen was born in 1194, the heir to two crowns, Germany and Sicily. His childhood was a swirl of contradictions. A Christian emperor raised among Muslims and Jews in Palermo, a city where Arabic astronomers debated side by side with Latin monks. He grew up speaking 6 languages and writing poetry in the Sicilian dialect that would later inspire Italian. He founded what we now call the Sicilian School of Poetry, the first European court to turn vernacular speech into literature. Centuries before Dante, Frederick's poets were already experimenting with rhyme and meter in the people's tongue rather than Latin. In his court, knowledge was the ultimate weapon. He surrounded himself with scholars like Leonardo Fibonacci, the mathematician who introduced Arabic numerals to Europe. He sponsored experiments in falconry, optics, even medicine. One chronicler claimed he dissected cadavers himself, centuries before such acts were acceptable. Frederick's curiosity terrified the church. He wanted proof, not parables. This rationalism wasn't entirely new. It echoed Arabic philosophers he admired. Frederick's court translated works by Averroes and Avicenna, whose writings argued that reason could coexist with revelation. The church saw those translations as dangerous imports from Islam. He trusted calculation more than revelation. He once demanded his priests demonstrate the soul's existence in measurable terms. When they couldn't, he scoffed, and the Vatican never forgave him. Twice he was excommunicated, first for defying a crusade, then for returning with Jerusalem under treaty rather than conquest. A Christian emperor who negotiated with Muslims was unthinkable. To his enemies, Frederick was the corruption of nature itself, a man who placed reason above faith. So when Salimbene de Adam, a Franciscan monk writing decades later, accused him of cruel and godless experiments, the story fit perfectly into the legend. A silent nursery where infants died seeking the language of God. What better way to paint the emperor as hubristic, blasphemous, inhuman? Yet, that very bias is our first clue. Salimbene belonged to a sect called the Joachimites, apocalyptic monks who believed Frederick was the beast of Revelation, the herald of the world's end. Their chronicles weren't history. They were prophecy disguised as reportage. But even if Salimbene invented the story, he didn't invent the question. Long before Frederick's time, another ruler had tried to hear the first human word, in an experiment that sounds strangely familiar. Long before Frederick II, another ruler had tried to eavesdrop on the language of creation. His name was Psamtik I, pharaoh of Egypt in the 7th century BCE. According to Herodotus, the so-called father of history, Psamtik wanted to know which people on Earth were the oldest, and by extension, which tongue was humanity's first. To find out, he designed what might be the earliest, controlled experiment ever recorded. Herodotus wasn't alone in such curiosities. Ancient Mesopotamian myths also spoke of a primordial language shared by gods and men, only shattered when humans built a tower to heaven. The Babel motif, born in Babylon, would echo through every civilization that followed. He ordered 2 newborns taken from their mothers and entrusted to a shepherd. The shepherd was commanded to care for them, to feed them goat's milk, but never, under any circumstances, to speak to them. Not a word. The infants were raised in total silence except for the bleating of goats. After 2 years, the children were said to have cried out a strange word, Bekos. When Psamtik's scholars investigated, they found that Bekos meant bread in the Phrygian language. The pharaoh took it as proof that the Phrygians, not the Egyptians, were humanity's first people, and that their language was the original tongue of the world. Modern historians, of course, recognize this as a legend rather than data. Herodotus was a storyteller. His histories blend ethnography, hearsay, and moral parable. But the myth reveals something deep about human curiosity. The belief that a pure or divine language existed before Babel obsessed cultures from Babylon to Byzantium. It promised a grammar uncorrupted by time or sin. And centuries later, Frederick's supposed experiment would replay that same desire almost word for word. The isolation of children, the expectation of revelation, the tragic silence. What Psamtik's myth began, medieval theology would turn into doctrine, a war over which tongue was closest to God's own. Because by the Middle Ages, language wasn't just communication anymore. It was theology, and to claim the wrong one could make you a heretic. By the 12th century, language had become a battlefield, not of armies, but of faith. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, words were sacred tools, handed down from the divine. To speak was, in some sense, to imitate God. In Jewish tradition, the Book of Genesis declared that Adam named all living creatures, establishing humanity's first act of mastery through speech. Many rabbis took this literally. Hebrew was the language of creation itself, the tongue God used to command light from darkness. The philosopher Judah Halevi, in his Kuzari, 1140, argued that Hebrew was inherently holy, its letters vessels of divine power. But in Christian Europe, theologians were less certain. After the biblical story of Babel, humanity's languages had been confused. Some scholars claimed Hebrew was preserved through Noah's line. Others insisted the world's languages were equal in the eyes of God, a view that risked accusations of heresy. In 1311, the Council of Vienne would even ban translating the Bible without church approval, a reminder that language itself could be treated as contraband. In the Islamic world, meanwhile, thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, debated whether language was wahi, divinely revealed, or a human convention born from need. Arabic, being the language of the Quran, held privileged status, but many philosophers argued that its perfection reflected structure, not supernatural origin. These debates flowed freely across borders. In Toledo, Spanish scholars were translating Arabic grammars into Latin, inventing comparative linguistics centuries before the term existed. Scholars no longer wanted only to quote scripture, they wanted to test it. The rise of scholasticism, championed by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon, sought to reconcile revelation with observation. Bacon in particular believed that language could be analyzed scientifically, that grammar was part of natural philosophy. Frederick II's own Sicilian court mirrored this spirit. His scholars compared Arabic and Latin treatises, translated astronomy and medicine, and collected texts from across the known world. Language for them wasn't merely holy, it was a system, a code that might reveal the workings of the cosmos itself. So when Frederick asked what language a child might speak if untouched by culture, he wasn't mocking theology. He was following the same impulse that would later drive scientists like Galileo to strip the world to its elements and see what remained. But the experiment he's accused of, the one where silence itself became the test, would yield a result no one expected. Because if Herodotus's children spoke, Frederick's would never utter a word. According to Salim Ben de Adam, the Franciscan chronicler who loathed the emperor, Frederick's experiment was simple and merciless. He gathered a group of infants, placed them in the care of wet nurses, and issued a decree. They were to feed and bathe the children, but never speak to them. No lullabies, no cooing, no gentle hums to soothe their cries. They were to raise them in silence, so that their first word might reveal the original language of humankind. Salambin wrote, "They could not live without the clapping of hands and the gladness of speech." It's one of the eeriest lines in any medieval chronicle. Scholars suspect Salambine borrowed it from monastic imagery, the idea that joy and song sustain the soul, and silence is a form of death. In monasteries, silence was discipline. In his tale, it became punishment. One by one, the infants died. Not from hunger or cold, but from the lack of human voice. No one recorded their number, nor their names, only the rumor of an emperor's vanity. But even here, the story cracks under scrutiny. No contemporary chronicler mentions the event. Neither Matthew Paris, who recorded Frederick's wars and excommunications in England, nor Richard of San Germano, who documented the emperor's court in Naples. Only Salambane tells it, and Salambane, as we've seen, had a holy hatred for Frederick. He wrote decades later, after Frederick's death, and he was a Joachimite, one of the apocalyptic Franciscans who believed the emperor was the Antichrist himself. In their eyes, this experiment was not science, but symbolism, a metaphor for blasphemy punished by divine justice. Frederick silenced the children, so God silenced him. To historians like David Abulafia and Ernst Kantorowicz, it's almost certain the tale was political fiction, a weapon of propaganda in the Church's information war against an emperor who refused to kneel. By the 1230s, pamphlets and sermons across Europe painted Frederick as the new pharaoh, oppressing God's people just as Egypt once enslaved Israel. The irony of linking him to an ancient ruler who performed the same experiment is almost too neat to be coincidence. And yet, there's something haunting about the myth. Because even if the story was false, the question it posed was real, so real that modern science would return to it centuries later, armed not with superstition, but with data. If a child never hears a human voice, can they ever learn to speak? And if not, what does that say about the origins of language itself? Frederick's alleged experiment can never be repeated, thank God. Modern science has ethics committees, the Middle Ages did not. Yet, fate has carried out its own grim replications. History has given us children raised in silence, not by design, but by neglect. The first and perhaps most famous was Victor of Aveyron, discovered in 1797 in the forests of southern France. He was around 10 years old, naked, scarred, and unable to speak. Locals thought he was an animal. 18th century France was obsessed with Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, that civilization corrupts natural innocence. Victor seemed to be living proof, and philosophers rushed to study him as if he were humanity's mirror before society. Scientists thought he was a window into our origins. A physician named Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard took him in, determined to civilize him through education and speech. He named him Victor, noting that the boy responded most strongly to the sound of the vowel O. For years, Itard tried to teach him to talk. Victor learned a handful of words, lait for milk, Dieu for God, but never formed sentences. He died in adulthood, still mute. At first, Itard thought Victor's silence proved language was learned through society. But later researchers noticed something darker. Victor had a deep scar across his throat. He might not have been feral at all, but an abused child abandoned because of a disability. His wildness may have been trauma, not nature. By the 20th century, psychology had turned Frederick's moral riddle into a laboratory question. Could deprivation itself reshape the brain? The answer came from tragedy, not design. Nearly 2 centuries later came another case, this time in California. In 1970, police found a girl they called Jeannie, kept by her parents locked in a small room since she was 20 months old. She had been tied to a chair, beaten for making sounds, fed in silence. When scientists began studying her, she was 13, far beyond infancy, yet linguistically newborn. Under the care of linguist Susan Curtis, Jeannie quickly learned dozens of words. But syntax, the grammar that binds words into thought, never came. She could say, applesauce buy store, but never, "We bought applesauce at the store." Her tragedy became the most studied case in psycholinguistics, confirming what earlier theorists like Erich Lenneberg had suspected. There is a critical period for language acquisition. If a child doesn't hear and use speech before puberty, the brain's language circuits, especially Broca's area, lose their flexibility. Victor and Jeannie's minds had survived isolation, but the scaffolding had withered in silence. They proved that language isn't just a learned behavior, it's a biological potential that requires nurture to bloom. In other words, without the human world, words themselves die. Frederick's infants, Victor, Jeannie, they all speak of the same truth. Language isn't born in us, it's born between us. The story of Frederick II might belong to the 13th century, but the question he asked still divides modern science. Where does language come from? Is it a divine spark, something innate? Or is it a social invention, born only when minds meet? In the mid-20th century, one man reignited this ancient quarrel, Noam Chomsky. In 1957, he published Syntactic Structures, a book that exploded the field of linguistics. His theories upended behaviorism, the reigning model that saw language as habit formation. For B.F. Skinner, speech was stimulus and reward. For Chomsky, it was proof of an inner architecture no reward system could explain. Chomsky argued that children are not blank slates absorbing language like parrots. Rather, they are born with an internal blueprint, a universal grammar, a set of cognitive rules that make language possible in the first place. No child, he said, could infer the complexity of grammar merely from what they hear. The speed and universality of language acquisition proved it was innate. Give any human infant enough input, Mandarin, English, or Arabic, and the same brain circuitry will awaken. Chomsky's revolution inspired decades of work in neurolinguistics. Researchers mapped how the Broca's and Wernicke's areas light up during speech, how babies at 6 months already distinguish the sounds of any world language, and how that ability fades as they tune to their native tongue. Cool, 2004. Dehane-Lamberts, 2017. The implication was staggering. Language is not taught, it's triggered. But others pushed back. Cognitive anthropologists like Michael Tomasello, 2003, and developmental psychologists such as Patricia Kuhl argued that language isn't an autonomous faculty. It's a social tool. Children learn grammar by reading intentions, gestures, context. When parents point, react, and correct, they're doing something no experiment or genetic code can replace. They're creating meaning through interaction. The modern consensus is something like a truce. Brain imaging and cross-cultural studies in the 1990s added nuance. Deaf children inventing spontaneous sign languages in Nicaragua showed that grammar can bloom wherever humans need to communicate, even without a model to copy. Yes, humans have unique neural architecture that prepares us for language, but without early social input, that circuitry remains silent. Nature gives us the instrument. Culture teaches us to play. In a way, both Samtic's myth and Frederick's tragedy misunderstood the same thing. They thought isolation would reveal the divine tongue. Instead, silence only proved that language is born of connection. Frederick wanted to hear what God had hardwired into us. But the truth is, God, or evolution, gave us only potential. It's each other who turned that potential into speech. If Frederick II's language experiment never truly happened, why has the story survived for 800 years? Why do we still whisper it, cite it, and, secretly, believe it could be true? Because it fits the image of an emperor too curious for his own salvation, a man who tried to dissect God's mysteries with a knife of reason. For medieval chroniclers, it was the perfect moral fable, curiosity punished by divine justice. The emperor silenced infants to hear the voice of heaven, and heaven answered, with silence. But the story's longevity isn't only theological, it's political. During Frederick's reign, the papacy waged an all-out propaganda war against him. Popes Gregory IX and Innocent IV excommunicated him twice, branding him the beast rising from the sea in the Book of Revelation. The medieval imagination loved continuity. If Frederick was the beast, his empire was Babylon reborn. Monks painted him in manuscripts with horns and serpent tails, a political cartoon centuries before newspapers. To church writers, every rumor of his arrogance became proof of demonic pride. Enter Salimbene de Adam, our sole witness. He wrote his Chronica decades after Frederick's death, describing him as a tyrant who loved astrology, blasphemy, and the company of Saracens. Salimbene was a Joachimite, a disciple of the mystic Joachim of Fiore, who had prophesied the end of days around the year 1260. In that framework, Frederick was not a ruler, but a symbol, the Antichrist, the man who would corrupt creation before Christ's return. His experiment, then, wasn't an observation, it was allegory, a parable of sin. Historians like Ernst Kantorowicz and David Abulafia note that this was a common medieval tactic. To defame an enemy, you didn't invent numbers or laws, you invented sins against nature. Claiming that Frederick murdered children for science would have been as shocking then as alleging satanic rituals today. It branded him as someone who defied both God and motherhood itself. Even so, the tale persisted far beyond the church's smear campaign. By the Renaissance, humanist scholars reread the story with fascination rather than horror. In 1530, the historian Polydore Virgil mentioned it as a curiosity of medieval ignorance, a sign of how far reason had come. It resurfaced in Enlightenment salons as a curiosity of pre-modern psychology, appeared in Umberto Eco's The Search for the Perfect Language, 1995, and in Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, 1966, as an emblem of man's futile attempt to classify the unclassifiable. In every retelling, the meaning shifted, from blasphemy to science fiction to philosophy. But the core fascination remained unchanged, because beneath all the theology and politics, the story taps into something deeper, an anxiety about what makes us human. We keep retelling Frederick's myth because it isn't just about language, it's about loneliness. The fear that if no one speaks to us, we cease to exist. So in the end, maybe Frederick's fatal question was never about words at all. Maybe it was about connection. He believed that if he stripped humanity of influence, no mothers, no lullabies, no language, what remained would be pure. But silence revealed nothing. It killed everything. Modern neuroscience gives us a clearer answer than any monk's chronicle ever could. Inside a newborn's brain, the circuitry for speech is there, dense clusters linking Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the auditory cortex. But those connections are like unstruck strings. They wait for resonance. When an infant hears a voice, neurons fire in synchrony. They begin mapping rhythm, tone, and meaning. By the late 1990s, MRI studies of infants showed that even newborns' brains pulse in time with their mother's speech patterns, a biological duet between caregiver and child. Without that feedback, those pathways atrophy. As linguist Patricia Kuhl once wrote, "Babies are born citizens of the world, but they become natives of one tongue through conversation." Every smile, every repetition, every nonsense word a parent murmurs into a crib, it isn't trivial. It's wiring language into flesh. When that soundscape is absent, the architecture collapses. That's what Victor, Jeannie, and all the silent children revealed. The human voice is as vital as food or warmth. And if you think about it, that's the real miracle. Language isn't a secret code left by God, but an emergent property of our need for one another. It's how the brain turns emotion into structure, structure into sound, and sound back into meaning. There is no original tongue. There's only the first time one human turned toward another and tried to make sense of the world together. Frederick searched for the language of God and heard only silence. But maybe that silence was the answer. Because if divinity exists in speech, it isn't in the words. It's in the act of reaching across the void to speak at all. And perhaps that's why every culture's myths begin with speech. In the beginning was the Word, says John's Gospel. The Quran opens with a command to recite. In many African cosmologies, creation itself happens when the first being names the world. We've been telling ourselves the same truth in different tongues, that language and life arise together. The miracle of language isn't that God spoke to us, it's that we learned to speak to each other. Here's a smarter,